Hey guys, back this week to talk about Hereditary. Um, Interesting film. I've seen this film any number of times now. I can't even count how many. I remember the first time I saw it, I found it very disturbing. It just has a creepy element to it that kind of sticks with you. I think most people would consider this a horror film, although I don't know that I necessarily, I mean, it has some horror elements to it, but I think it is just straight up a tragedy, right? There's certainly the sort of they tie in all that stuff with Paimon, which I think is completely all that stuff's made up. I don't know where they got that from, but it does have some of those horror elements, but it certainly could be categorized as a Greek tragedy. So I wanted to talk about that just a little bit briefly. Just the concept of the tragedy. A lot of that comes from the Greeks. Of course, we've carried that on with you know William Shakespeare. Many of his plays were tragedies, and of course, he was heavily influenced by the Greeks. But the kind of the purpose of that, a lot of people in horror or maybe weird fiction even, these disturbing kinds of stories can be off-putting to people. A lot of people are like, well, life is hard enough without that stuff. Why would I want to expose myself to that? But the idea behind it is like exposing yourself to this make-believe tragedy can actually help you manage the stuff that's in your own life. It can kind of help you work through that psychologically and maybe even give you a psychological or emotional outlet for it. Aristotle argued that very famously in his it's called Poetics, where he talks about how the viewer being exposed to a tragedy can produce a catharsis, which is that emotional response that can help them work through that. Like, if you're watching a play and these terrible things happen to this character, it can actually make you value the things in your own life that much more. And so this is a very common form of storytelling for human beings. The tragedy for the Greeks too was kind of interesting because they believed in fate, right? They believed that, and I think you could argue the Norse, the Norse communities believe that too. A lot of these ancient cultures that human beings were just fated to have things happen to them. And part of the tragedy of watching these things unfold is that you can see that this stuff is going to happen to this character, even though they don't realize it. So, of course, we see that in Hereditary with Peter and the family. And so, Peter's sort of fated to what happens to him. And one of the most tragic parts of any of these kinds of stories is that main character isn't noticing things. Um, Peter doesn't notice everything that's happening around him. He's not putting two and two together, even though the signs are very real and they're in his face. And I think that makes it more difficult for us as viewers to watch and process, because it's kind of like watching that train wreck and you want to just stop things from happening. The other interesting element I think with Hereditary though is the way that they tie in mental illness. Does Annie or her mom even, there's an element of mental illness in there, and is that, does fate actually exist? Are we sort of fated to some of the things that happen in our lives, things that are beyond our control? I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I mean, I certainly think that we get dealt a hand of cards, right, that are beyond our control. I mean, we're born into certain families, and some of our families are prone to things like mental illness, or in my family, heart problems have been sort of what you could call a curse of fate. It took my dad from me when I was a very young man. They took my sister. Um, and so those were tragic events that my family had to deal with. And sometimes I remember as a younger person, it very much did feel like, hey, are we fated to this? Is this something that's going to happen to me? Am I going to go down this road? And so you kind of have to work your way through that. I certainly don't believe in that. I believe that human beings have their own power to change their trajectory. I don't know that some of those things are beyond our control, but I certainly think that we have some power. So I know there's a lot of people that tend to be like, oh, you're just a product of your environment or you're a product of what happens to you in your life. But I don't know that I would go to either extreme. I think that we certainly have our own volition, and we're certainly capable of changing that trajectory to some degree, right? There's some things that are just beyond our control. And so um, the terrible thing about the tragedy in Hereditary is I think, you know, Annie seems to be exhibiting what you could call mental illness, and then of course Peter seems to follow down that road as well. You could certainly look at the film that way and just, you know, chalk the supernatural elements up to that. We don't really know, and I like the fact that they don't really explain that. Is this all something that is a product of mental illness, or is there really this demonic presence that's haunting this family? Either way, the problems happen because the family continues to look past the warning signs. I mean, even the father, and his name's escaping me right now, Gabriel Byrne plays him. I mean, there's all kinds of warning signs that he just ignores with Annie's behavior and Peter as well, and he just seems to keep looking past them. So, interesting film. I think it says a lot about that struggle that we have between, are we fated? Are we just kind of you know, a product of the things that happen to us, or do we have our own choice? And I don't know that human beings have ever quite solved that riddle. I think it could. I tend to think we're somewhere in the middle, right? But it's up to you to kind of figure that out. I'll be curious to see what you guys say in your mini paper responses this week. Definitely looking forward to reading those and seeing if you think there is some kind of element of fate in your own destiny. So hope you enjoy the movie, and I'll see you guys next week. Have a great rest of your day.